Welcome to I Just Don't Know, a podcast where we learn something new, challenge opinions, and hope to make the misinformed informed. I can openly say I've spoken when I did not need to, been unnecessarily controversial, and shared my misinformed opinion, thinking it was not. In this podcast, I'll try to right some wrongs and take on a new topic each episode that I think I knew, but in fact, I just don't know. This episode is all about temptation, desire for that instant gratitude, and managing to say no to the offer of your favourite treat like crisps, cookies, sweets or chocolate. I am talking about self-control. And my first assumption that I'm going to outline here is that when you think about self-control and trying not to have that biscuit from the biscuit tin or not have that, or have those treats in the evening, I'll be honest, I in the past and often I do fall into a routine of falling for that trap. And, well, I call it a trap. In the evening, you just can't help but have that extra bit of chocolate or have that little bit something sweet in the evening and feed that desire that's just asking for that instant gratification that just makes you sort of that little bit of happiness for that moment. And I completely understand why it is so hard. So I wanted to look at in a bit more detail why we just sort of look at it on a very much a surface level, and we don't help ourselves by breaking it down into a bit more detailed way of looking at how we control what we do. And the classic sayings are sort of, I'm a strong person and I have strong willpower and and people say, come on, control yourself, don't have it. Or the temptation of someone going, go on, have a biscuit, and having the strength of saying no in the desire of having gratification later on. Does everyone do that? Does everyone manage self-control by delaying their gratification to a later time? And that's going to be the first sort of assumption or generalization that I'm going to look at. And so let's see how that goes. So first off, looking at an article I found from Lifehack, they define sort of controlling your emotions and desires is, in difficult situations, is the sort of the definition of good self-control. And studies say that sort of exhaustion is a key factor to why self-control is reduced in someone. So they focus on the taxes of your patience throughout the day, how different stresses slowly but surely erode your ability to fight that sort of little voice in your head. And that's why later on, when you get back from work, binge eating and eating the food that you said no to earlier in the day, it's just too difficult to say no. The signs of your self-control diminishing is you become a little bit more agitated or irritable, or there's a lack of patience. So they're again not the easiest things to notice in someone. But self-control is not, you could say then, it changes throughout the day, but some people believe that they have that discipline or self-control constantly. But in reality, your body is slowly but surely wearing away. So therefore, temptation or the desire to do something that you feel like for that instant gratification is more likely to happen as the day goes on, or as you become more tired or more stressed, and you will give in to the impulse of emotions. And we're going to look at a little bit later what is the difference between giving in to temptation and giving in to the impulse of your emotions, because I think they're two different things, and I've read a few things that we're going to, as I said, going to look at later. They are very different, being tempted and giving into your impulses. But this Lifehack article gave some nice tips to try and look at how you improve your how to be more sort of your self-control. And the first one is you've got to practice it. You've got to put yourself in a position where you have to show self-control. And if I think about all the many little sort of snacking policies that I put in, like not having any biscuits in the flat, or one big one for me is I cannot have Nutella in the flat because I will eat the whole jar without a doubt, or slowly but surely eat it throughout the day, or have the cereal. I just love cereal. I just would have bowls after bowls, and my portion control is terrible, and I keep being told that when it comes to cereal. So if I only have one small box of it, I will ration it better. So practice is really important. The second one is distraction. When you do feel like you want to do something to gain that instant gratification, or you'll get that impulse to do something, or you're tempted by something, try to distract yourself with something else. That is a way. How that is done, that's easier said than done, I would say. But it does sort of work. Maybe you're hungry, maybe going for a snack, maybe doing a bit of exercise, and then having the food after that. So you've managed to do something, you delayed it, and you're rewarding yourself. And if you think you heard of my podcast before this, the episode before this, rewarding yourself after exercise is really important as well. So they're sort of linked there. The third one is to care for yourself. Your impulses and your ability to be self-control is dependent, as I said earlier, on your sort of patience and your stress levels and how tired you are. So if you look after yourself and you sleep well, and you make sure you are sort of well nourished and you've had everything, the food you required for that day, the chances of you giving in to those temptations or giving into any impulses that you wish you didn't are less likely. So that's the third one. And the last one is your environment, managing your environment around you. If you've got lots of temptations, there's, as I said, about having what you have in the flat and have in your house, means you might go and have those things. Remove them if you don't really know you don't need having all those chocolate bars in your flat, in your sort of fridge or cupboard. But if you think about work, try not to go to the kitchen when you hear there's loads of free food. I struggle to do that one. I can't help myself. Who doesn't love free food? But it depends what it is. My policy is if it's not decent and it hasn't been sitting out for a long time, then that's okay. Sorry, I got that wrong. It has to be decent and it mustn't be sitting out for a long time. Otherwise, it's just not worth it. So that's just some basic stuff from Lifehack, a very, very generalized article. But what I wanted to touch on is to continue to think about how do you control your willpower and what does it actually mean to have good self-control or show that. I saw a great TED talk by Jonathan Bicker that was really interesting, how he broke down different approaches to self-control using the example of sort of smoking or eating disorders. There's two approaches of the first approach of just avoidance, the avoidance approach. Just don't do it at all. That approach was the more traditional way of looking things. So going teetotal or not eating a certain type of food, not smoking and counting how many days you've done, has been proven successful. But what he wanted to suggest was a different sort of approach called the willingness approach, almost acceptance approach. And how that is presented by him is that you need to condition yourself to focus on when you have that impulse to do something, or when you are tempted by something and then that results in an impulse to have that instant gratification, then you need to say, okay, I'm having a thought that I would like that biscuit, or I would like a biscuit. But then he also says, okay, once you've done that, you need to say, every time you have a thought saying, I am having the thought that I really want a biscuit, say to yourself, I acknowledge that I've just had a thought that I've really want a biscuit. And by stepping away from the actual desire, the actual impulse, 2 steps almost, acknowledging that you're having that impulse, then acknowledging that you've acknowledged that you've had that impulse, accepting that you've had that impulse of wanting a biscuit, it creates that space between you and what you really want to do. And by noticing that and giving that room, you can then think about making decisions, and decisions is control, and decisions is behavior. So that is a really fascinating way of approaching it, and I think it's easier said than done. But I think for myself, the last 5-6 years, I've definitely noticed when I'm doing things and I've acknowledged it. But I think before that, when I was a teenager, I would acknowledge that I did something. But I've noticed I would do something, but I wouldn't acknowledge that I've noticed that I'm doing something. Almost making a note that, oh, I've done that silly thing again. Before I'd go, oh, that was silly. But I wouldn't say, I've noticed that I've done something silly again. And I think that's the next level, that layer that Jonathan Bicker has added to try and help someone. And he proved it with some statistics that people who are taking the willingness approach were 2 times more likely as feeling like they had a better, that they were going to achieve the goal that they were going to achieve. And he also had some proving experiments with people that they were much likely to achieve the goals of not smoking. I think that was the example they're using. It was smoking, that by doing this approach, that acceptance took it to the next level. And this is where it got a bit interesting, and I'll just touch on this lightly, was that by creating that space between having that impulse and the self-control being in question, acknowledging that you've had that thought that you wanted something, you then were able to break down why you were having that thought. And there was one example of, you did something such as like wanting a drink. Well, why do you want to drink? Well, you want to drink because you feel bad that you want to drink in the first place. And it's like a full circle. And how he breaks it down into like a tug of war with that monster inside you, or that temptation monster inside you that's saying, come on, have a drink, come on, have this, or come on, eat that biscuit. Let's keep this lighthearted. Let's talk about biscuits only. He says, don't try and pull against that sort of that monster inside you, or that person that voice inside you, because eventually throughout the day you will lose because you'll get tired. What he suggests, though, is to go, okay, rather than playing tug of war with this voice inside your head, just let go of the rope and don't participate, and say, okay, yes, I am having that desire to have a biscuit, and that's fine, and that's okay. And eventually that voice in your head will say, okay, cool, okay, let's not play, but you still really want a biscuit. And eventually that voice should get quieter and quieter and quieter, and eventually it might even go away. And I really liked how Jonathan Bicker put that, and it's really interesting to put the approach of self-control in just a very normal way, how he approached that. So yeah, really, really great stuff, and maybe you guys should try that out. I'm definitely going to try it more. I've definitely tried it a little bit since I first sort of researched it and looked at it. How successful it is, very difficult to measure, but we will see. So my second assumption, or the generalizations that I've often heard about or spoken about when it comes to self-control, is more about, what I'm going to look here is about how is it different between one person and another. I know some people who are very disciplined and they stick to the regime and they stick to what they have to. I know people who are very strict for a portion of the day or for 5 days, but then they just fall to pieces the next days and they do everything, they give in to all their temptations. It varies person to person. And so what that suggests in my eyes is that self-control fluctuates, it varies person to person, but it can change. People can turn a new leaf and turn a new page, whatever the saying is, and improve their self-control, their discipline. And I think the big one here is like exercising more, getting more, sort of eating a bit healthier, so you're getting the better nutrients in your body, better vitamins, and you're looking after yourself better. In that way, you will be able to exercise self-control better, and you'll be able to aim for better goals or stronger, more ambitious goals in the long term, as you give into instant gratification less and less. And I think the one that I would love to talk about on another episode is the instant gratification of social media, and how when people give up social media or they minimize their time using it, they're able to achieve more, and they can see clear gains in their life when they don't give into this temptation that is on everyone's phone and is one of the worst temptations out there, I think. So that's my assumption here. What is self-control measurable, and can it change with some person? Because so what I've done, I'm going to look into this in a bit more detail and see of the history of it and how academics have looked at it in the past on a very general view, just to share it with you guys and see how that works out. So let's go. So I want to kick this off with two people who are very famous in the world of social control and self-control theories, and that is Travis Hirschi and Michael Gottfredson. So I'll say that again: Travis Hirschi and Michael Gottfredson. It seems they are the original sort of academics, authors, psychologists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that really pioneered the discourse and discussion about theory of self-control, and really got people thinking about this very open-ended and controversial topic that does influence our day-to-day and how we look at each other and how we manage countries and how we manage teams and companies. And what their first theory that they laid out in the 60s is the social control theory. Looking and sort of leading the way as sociologists in this space, it fundamentally said that low levels of control and the social aspects of around you were directly related to deviant behavior and doing wrong and doing something bad towards someone, or breaking rules or breaking the law. So fundamentally, this is the basis here, that social bonds with your family, your school, your workers are key to making sure people don't give in to deviant behavior as they describe it, and managing your self-control. So according to Hirschi, these bonds are based on attachment. That's the first one. So I'm just sort of paraphrasing here. Attachment, mainly parental attachment, but as well also to the sort of social bonds with friends, but also the commitment of your activities, whether that's with how much time and energy you put into what you're doing. That could be your education, your career. The third one is your involvement in activities. So what are you actually doing in your day-to-day and in your life? This is a key influencer to this situation. And then your last one is the belief in the social values. So there's the four axes: your attachments, your commitment, your involvement of what you're doing, and your belief in the wider social values. So that could be, obviously, religion impacts that, nationalism, what you think about the world as well. So that's a very open-ended. And this is from Siegel and McCormick, who in 2006 they've criticised and analysed Hirschi and Gottfredson's sort of theories here. So that's the social control theory, very much about your environment. If we go back to what I said earlier in the episode, your environment is a key factor to managing your self-control. But they don't stop there. They actually move on to a slightly different theory, and they develop it a bit more in the sort of 80s and 90s. So that is the self-control theory, also known as the general theory of crime, which is their book that they published. So what they try and do in this general theory of crime, or self-control theory, is that they actually say that the social bonds that they outlined in the social control theory is that all these environmental factors are just an insulating factor. They prevent someone from giving in due to low self-control. They're not actually a contributing factor to the act itself. And what they say in the general theory of crime is that low self-control is a key factor in underlying criminality or giving in and doing something you shouldn't be doing. And I know I've escalated this a little bit to criminality, but this is just how they've outlined self-control I know I started with giving in and having a biscuit, but we're moving this up to a high heat. So we'll see how it goes. And so what they more controversially outline is that self-control in someone or in their personality, or if they have a lack of self-control, then this stays constant and stays stable throughout across their life. And what they're saying in a theoretical perspective is that people don't change, it is opportunity that changes. And this is, well, I'm not sure how, when I read this, I wasn't really sure how I felt about it, because I think people can change and they can control their self-control habits, and that it's not fair to say that someone is not able to do that. But then maybe you could be sort of more lenient there and say that the people do change, but their opportunities have to change as well, and their environment and their opportunities are the contributing factor to their improved self-control. So that's a slightly different view that from my perspective there, if we're thinking theoretically. But what they're saying though there is that someone's self-control in their upbringing, if they're not given that training as a young person, that not giving in to the desire for instant gratification, or not giving in to those impulses of heightened emotion, then they haven't been trained to learn that. And fundamentally, if parents don't have that same self-control, they're never going to be able to teach their kids. And I did read an article on positivepsychology.com. The author was Kelly Miller over in the US. She's a very wholesome sort of author, very popular, leading the way with helping humans to look at sort of positive psychology in positive ways. She was reading through her article. It was a bit like she's talking from a very strong position and making life look a lot very easy. In reality, has she been exposed to those temptations and difficult situations? Because fundamentally, she says that there's alarming levels of obesity and addiction and violence in the world, and this tells us that the intentional improvement in self-control practices is needed, and that people need to realize that if they don't learn self-regulation and self-control, then it will just be a constant challenge for society and the world, as they bring up children that don't get those fundamental lessons when they're children about how to manage their self-control. So it's a bit sort of negative view, but then more optimistically, I was reading about the criticism of Hershey and Gottfried Stern, and the general view that self-control stays constant and people cannot change, and that social factors are actually a secondary factor. Well, some people have said, for example, Univa et al., as well as Akers and Sellers, suggests that the theory of crime that they outline, saying that that crime and low self-control are one of the same, that's very difficult to actually measure what self-control is empirically. And Siegel and McCormick in 2006 also claim the same thing, that how do you actually measure low self-control? We can't measure low self-control. You can't put it as a reason for people committing crime and giving in. Low self-control is not the fundamental factor here. There is so many other things to think about, and someone's situation, the environment. And I think you're taking the power out of people's control, saying that they are fundamentally the product of their upbringing, and they're not the product necessarily of their environment that they have some control over, which is where they are, what they're doing. And going back to the article by Kelly Muller, I believe she doesn't really consider that some people's environments are not in their control as well, and that temptations that you might have are so difficult to resist that just because you give in, you're then branded that you have low self-control and your parents weren't able to bring you up properly. When in reality, some environments are so harsh, so difficult, it requires a bigger force to help them get out of that. And I don't want to put any sort of actual details into that, but I think you cannot generalize just the environment or the upbringing. Well, let me rephrase it. You can't just say that if someone gives in to something or shows in terms of lack of self-control, or they give in to things like instant gratification, they are fundamentally poorly brought up, and they are badly brought up in the sense of self-regulation, self-control, and they have low self-control. Therefore, according to the theory of crime, they're more likely to commit crime. Another sort of critique is that how do you prove where people have shown that they have delayed gratification, such as sort of high-level, big financial crimes? How does it suggest that? Because people have shown that they have great self-control, but they still commit crimes. And that is from Lilly et al. In 1995. She sort of pioneers that point of view. And I think that's a really good point of view, because the way I look at that is people who have poor self-control, they can mask it by their environment, they can mask it by some of their behaviors or their support. But I think some people show great self-control over the period of their lives, going through school, going through university, getting qualifications, but eventually they get tired, they give in to the easy desires, and as they get older they just let it all go, and they commit some horrendous crimes because of their positions, their power, or they do things that shouldn't be done, relationships break down. And that's going back to my original point of people not looking after themselves, getting tired later on in the day, but this time later on in life, and your self-control changes. So I challenge what these original sociologists have suggested with the theory of crime and the self-control theory, that self-control is constant and stable throughout life. I think it definitely changes. People can manage it, people can practice it and get better at self-control. They can learn different ways of distracting themselves. They can learn different ways of being more in control of situations when let's say their emotions. So I read one area where it was all about hot and cold. So your body's either hot with emotion and making decisions, and the prefrontal cortex of the brain is not engaged at all. And then you have the cool system where you can make rational decisions, and your prefrontal part of the brain is active, and that's where you make those rational decisions. But there is theory and potential evidence that if your stress levels are managed and you know how to get yourself in a position where you can limit your stress levels just by a bit, so when you are in those situations of extreme emotion and you're hot, as that person says in the article, you can still engage some part of your brain that does make rational decisions and thinks about long-term goals rather than short-term goals such as instant gratification, and you can make a different decision and exercise that self-control that we all aspire to have more consistently, more constantly. So that's a couple of things to think about, a bit more theoretical at the end there. It's reminding me of some of the times of when I was at university. And I really got stuck into this and enjoyed sort of reading about this a bit more, because the implications are pretty important. So to wrap up this podcast episode, so going back to my first assumption of the generalization of having great willpower and being able to control yourself and not give in to having that biscuit, there's some nice ways of looking at it, of practicing and distracting yourself and looking after yourself and managing your environment, where you can try to avoid getting into situations where you can get agitated and stress levels go up, and your lack of and you show a lack of patience, and you give into those emotions, or you give into those temptations of having that favorite treat of yours, or chocolate or crisps. you can practice it and you can get into it. And Jonathan Bicker, trying to acknowledge that you're having the thought of that impulse or giving into that temptation, and then once you've acknowledged that you've had the thought, acknowledging that you've acknowledged that you've had the thought, to then distance yourself from the impulse or the desire itself, and therefore giving yourself room to think about it and actually make a decision rationally. So some really nice ways of actually looking at day-to-day self-control situations, and just having great willpower is there's so much more to that, and that's really interesting. And then the second one about self-control, can it be changed, can it improve, what are some of the theories behind self-control in terms of the academic world? Well, that's been a deep dive in a very, very small little hole, because there's so much more out there that you could read about. But we've touched on some sort of old pioneers of this theory with Hershey, Gottfredson, and you've got Siegel and McCormick, who I quite like their analysis of the whole thing, and you've got and some others that have criticised the situation. But what my sort of view there of the theory of crime and the self-control theory, self-control can change in someone and is not fundamental to each person, is not consistent based on their upbringing, and it doesn't necessarily just lead to crime. There's so many other factors to consider, and I think that's a more optimistic way of looking at things. People can change and adapt to their self-control, and also a lot of people who show great self-control when they're younger and in their middle ages, but actually when they get older, they get tired and they don't look after themselves, and in the end they make some terrible decisions and do some terrible things. So there's clear evidence that self-control fluctuates, in my point of view, and it's been a really fascinating way of breaking down what actually self-control is. And leaving it on a optimistic note, I think, and we should think, that our self-control and our ability to control our decisions can improve, it can be managed, and fundamentally we can become a better society and world through just that general progression of better self-control when needed, but also having that biscuit when you deserve it, and when you just go, what the heck, let's just give and have some chocolate and enjoy ourselves and enjoy life. So yeah, thanks so much for a slightly different podcast again. I'm enjoying the different ways of approaching this, and I'm excited to record another one. Thanks so much, guys.